So today we're going to do a special report, the Pope and the one dropper rule. So there's so much I could talk about, but we're going to focus on this just real quick. The one drop rule was designed to hurt us, Black folks, but it actually made us stronger. That's something I say in my book. In Qualified, my book, I write about the architecture of race in America and how systems were in fact designed not just to exclude us, but to actually fracture our identity and weaponize any trace of our ancestry. So few things demonstrate this better or more clearly about how the one drop idea came to be than what happened after Bacon's Rebellion, which many of you know I talk about all the time. So in 1676, a small multiracial coalition of poor whites, indentured servants, Black servants, and enslaved Africans rose up together. And Virginia's elite were like, we can't have this. So they responded by inventing race-based laws, inventing to divide and conquer any potential future uprisings. And one of the most damaging was something called partus sequitur ventrum, a Latin phrase that means that which is born follows the womb. This meant that the legal status of the mother would be the legal status of the child. So if the mother was enslaved, the child would be enslaved. The father, who was often a white male slaveholder who had raped an enslaved woman, well, this allowed him to escape responsibility, but ensured that he profited from the rape because he basically impregnated a woman to create someone he could sell, right? It erased the father's obligation entirely and cut off the child's claim to that lineage. It also laid the legal and ideological foundation for the one drop rule. So anyone with Black ancestry, no matter how distant, could be denied freedom, opportunity, and in a word, whiteness, because that's what all those things were. So, it's funny as a Black American, when I saw images of Pope Leo's mother, it was strange because she looked a lot like my paternal grandmother. And I know it would be hard for you to look at me and think that, but it's true. My father's mother. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture, it'll hopefully pop up here, of my great great grandmother. And when you see her, you can see she looks kind of Norwegian. So in our family, like in so many Black families, race is not determined by color alone, right? Some of us are pale as parchment. Others have bronze skin. Some of us are dark chocolate, but we still see ourselves through that identity lens. And that is a direct result of the one drop rule in the United States. It made us that. It made us that. It made us one family, one society. But DNA alone isn't the issue. And DNA doesn't lie, but history, it can lie. And according to a 2014 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, guess what? Self-identified white people in the American South, especially in, Louisiana and South Carolina, carry the highest rates of African ancestry. Likely has to do with passing. The average African American, however, has about 24% of European ancestry. That's on average. And, I do have to back up here and say we must understand race is not biology. It is a social and legal invention. And yet, it's been written into every structure of American life, from, who could vote to who you could marry to where you were allowed to live. That's why people had to pass as white, right? And they weren't the only ones who did it. They weren't the only ones. But when you look at how high the stakes were, it's no surprise that some people passed as white. Sometimes out of shame, yes, but often out of necessity. To pass was to gain access to jobs, to schools, to neighborhoods, to safety, to the full rights of white citizenship. It's an explicit statement that Black people did not have that access. Now, you lost something, right? To pass was to lose your name, your people, your sense of self. And for many, there was shame and you had to hide and nobody could even know. They could never know. I mean, that's a lot of pressure. But like I said, it wasn't just Black Americans. I've spoken to Jewish Americans, Native Americans, light skinned Latinx, Hispanic people who all have family histories of people who passed, all trying to escape a racial caste system that marked them for exclusion. So, a famous story is that of Anatole Broyard. He was the New York Times book critic, and he passed for white his entire adult life. He was also from Louisiana. His daughter, Bliss Broyard, didn't learn that her father was part Black until just before he died. And her mother told her, "Your father's part Black," like they're at the hospital. That secret shaped their family's life. And it was a lie meant to protect, but it fractured generations in the sense that she did not have connection to that family. She eventually wrote a book. I do believe her book was called One Drop, actually. In this context, Pope Leo's story is the American story, right? The Pope and his family, that is our actual, all of our American story. Louisiana Creole, they have this phrase called passe blanc, passing for white. Jari Honora traced the Pope's maternal line in the Black community in New Orleans. And his mother, Mildred Martinez, was the daughter of allegedly a Haitian immigrant. And I say that because I looked at other research that says over time they kind of changed. They would say they were from Dominican, Haiti, or Louisiana. This is not uncommon with people who are passing to shift their identity. But in any event, Pope Leo's brother said no one talked about that openly in the family. In fact, his brother, John Provost, told the New York Times, well, as far as they knew, they were white, right? And as for their mother, she might have said Spanish. That kind of ambiguity isn't surprising in a country where one drop could determine your fate, right? Many people made that decision. And for me, I wonder a bit about his father. I'd be interested in his ancestry because his brother said, well, our father said he was an orphan and he didn't know anything about his family. That is also a hallmark of passing, where people talk about being orphans. They don't know they don't have any connection to their family as a way of hiding. So the idea that perhaps two Creole people met in Chicago and passed for white is not out of the realm of possibility. The thing of it is, the truth has a way of surfacing itself, right? It has a way of coming up. And so here we are, from my book, a little quote from my book here. It says, "It was never about color. It was about denying access to freedom, opportunity, and whiteness." And that is really, really important for us to understand. You know, the one drop rule did create issues within the African American community. I mean, here's the thing: Louisiana was the only, not the only state, but the state that really leaned into a stratification of racial hierarchies around color. And that had a lot to do with Louisiana's Italian, Spanish, and French roots. And so as a result, they did have that quadroon, octoroon, and some of the men there who had children by Black women concubines or colored women concubines, they developed balls and a whole social structure for their children who were mixed race. That was not commonly done. And so there's a complex, even more complex history as you dig into Louisiana's culture and history. But this is not to say that that didn't happen. But the one drop rule is different than that. The one drop rule is a sense of identity for Black people that, again, is not based on the actual color of their skin. But we do have colorism and classism. And that has led to hierarchies within the Black community in the United States, right? Because being light skinned, unlike, say, in Brazil or other countries, you couldn't openly say that. You had to hide the fact that you had any Blackness in you. Any light skinned Black people had to pass in order to survive. What I like to say is that the one drop rule was meant to harm us, but in many ways it helped us because it gave us a sense of shared identity that allowed us to scale, quite frankly, historic change. Some of the biggest historic changes in the history of the world. The other interesting thing about the one drop rule that people don't know is that both the apartheid regime in South Africa and the Nazis in Germany came to study Jim Crow and the way racism was enacted against Black people in the United States as they developed their oppressive regimes. And Jim Crow and the one drop rule were two races for the South Afrikaners and the Nazis. Now that's a fact. You can look that up and you can read that in my book. But for the Nazis, the thing was, well, we're not going to discount 99% of German blood for 1% of Jewish blood. Again, let's acknowledge these things are not real. This is how people are thinking. But they weren't willing to go that far. And the Afrikaners in South Africa, as you know, set up more of almost a Louisiana scale of colorism. Black Africans, mixed race, Asian. They did a whole, chart of color, which prevented a shared identity because this one group's getting a little bit more, so they're invested. But in the United States, we didn't have that. What you have to understand is these people were passing in a system that was too racist to replicate for the Nazis and too racist to replicate for the Afrikaners who were taking over South Africa. That is the system in which these people were living, which is why they were passing. So I hope this is interesting. This week we're going to talk about some more things in the news. The firing of 3 Black officials in the government agencies. We're going to talk about the unemployment rate of Black women. We're going to talk about more news things. News is moving so fast. It's hard to stay up with it, but I thought this detour was worth the conversation. Thanks.